Over the past weekend, I wrecked my internet connection by downloading the nearly 100 gigabyte open beta of Diablo 4, and after spending roughly 12 hours hacking and slashing my way through undead and demons, I've come out the other side relatively impressed. For the record, I'm not a die-hard fan of action RPGs, but I do play a decent number of them, though I lean heavier towards the role-playing component than the action. To that end, I've played through a handful of other ARPGs outside of the Diablo franchise, but it's never been more than casually dipping my toes in. Diablo 4 is both a natural evolution of the franchise and feels like a breath of fresh air, even though it took 10 years to get here. My main source of enjoyment in the Diablo 4 beta mostly came from the story setup and world building.
Tristram, the Horadrim of old imprisoned Diablo, the Lord of Terror beneath the earth. And then they built this town nearby. You can see how that turned out.
There's a lot of deep lore from the previous games in the series, and instead of getting bogged down in it with the very first cinematic, you're thrown into a more mysterious setup with little explanation. This leads to a better narrative experience, because leading with an info dump tends to turn people off. Furthering the feel of being a stranger in a strange land is how there's ample flavor dialogue you can seek out across the world. Every city or settlement you wander into has various NPCs whom you can get small lines out of that help to shed light on their struggles and place in the world.
It's a hard life here, but with the dangers and the mines. But if I'm lucky, could make it 5 more years without sight of injury or death.
This leads us to one of the larger and most impactful changes to the Diablo formula that helps to shape the game. The fact that it is an actual open world. The previous games were built around moving from one major city hub to another and exploring the wilds around each one. It was effectively separate instances which were clearly aligned with the segmented sections of the story. In Diablo 4, however, you just literally move your feet and hoof it from one city to another with no loading screens between locations. While venturing across the landscape, you can kill all of the enemies you want, and there's no shortage of randomly spawned mini-dungeons to go into just for the fun of exploration and the loot that you can find. In addition to this, there are world events that happen at random, which effectively serve as a faster, more combat-driven method of getting to a loot chest. All of this combines into a far more seamless experience than I've ever had in previous ARPGs, and it goes a long way in making the game more fluid. It always feels like you're continuously moving, exploring the wilds, finding the next settlement, and if the running gets boring, there's always a larger combat distraction not too far away. This is all helped by how the game, for better or worse, is always online. It's effectively treated like a massive multiplayer online game, where you can reasonably ignore all the other players, but occasionally will interact with them by taking on some of the same random world events at the same time. Despite how I, personally, hate playing with internet randos, it's still nice to see that Poop Loser 69 is making regular visits to the town vendors to sell and improve gear as much as I do myself. Though going to town and seeing so many other players on screen at the same time clearly taxes the game, as heading to the largest settlement, Kiovashad, always led to a pretty significant drop in frame rate. As for the settlements and cities, as already stated, there's plenty of flavor dialogue, but there's also a decent number of side quests to complete as well. Add to this how there are some fairly complex crafting systems complete with resources you can gather out in the wild, and you end up with the harder number crunching part of the game that ties into the action part of an action RPG. In addition to the classic loot system and trying to find your next perfect pair of boots or gloves, you can also spend a fair amount of time at vendors doing a variety of things. You can deconstruct your loot for materials or cosmetic unlocks, reinforce old equipment, enchant extra features onto your gear, strip features off of old gear, gem crafting, potions and alchemy, the list goes on. There's a lot to dig into with the deeper systems, and since you level up quickly, they let you hold on to your preferred gear for just a little bit longer before you're ultimately forced to discard that old yellow quality helmet that helped you so much, but you outleveled its usefulness in what feels like 2 hours. This is in addition to the normal talent tree that you work your way through, which also has a fair amount of depth and variety. I only played a barbarian, which, according to what I've heard, was one of the more modestly balanced heroes that offered a challenge. This led me to feeling like, even when I died during a few boss battles, that I was never too far from winning, and I only ate dirt because I got lazy about trying to dodge attacks. At the very least, balancing was not an issue in my limited experience. The ultimate takeaway is how Diablo 4 has plenty of depth in everything it offers. Character builds and combat have plenty of variety, the world doesn't feel restrictive, there's plenty of places to search for loot, there are different things you can do with the loot you find, and the story does not get caught up in old lore right from the start, leading to a more compelling narrative. Diablo, as a franchise, has long since stopped being the standard bearer for the ARPG genre, but what's here is in every measure good. Granted, there's space for things to still go wrong, as what I played was an open beta, leaving the rest of what's to come an open question. There's also the always online design of the game, which is honestly unnecessary, but it's not as poorly planned or implemented as how it was with Diablo 3 10 years ago. Given all of this, I'm not afraid to say that Diablo 4, on the merits of the open beta alone, is worth a real look for purchase. Sadly, my budget lands me in a place where I'm choosing to forego it because of other big releases this year. However, that doesn't mean I won't probably go back and give it the good shake I think it deserves once release season is over and all of the dust has settled. Anyway, that's all I had to say. So, like always, I'm William Strife, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.